History Secrets.
What happens when someone decides to truly teach within a system that doesn't want to learn? In 2008, a young Yale graduate arrives in southern China with a clear mission. He didn't just want to prepare students to enter foreign universities. He wanted to prepare them for life. At the time, the landscape was quite different. Few students were seeking to study abroad, and international schools were still rare. Even so, at that specific school, about 10% of students planned to follow that path. Around 80 students per year. The number seemed promising, but the method was completely wrong. Students spent hours in crowded classrooms, copying notes, memorizing content, and repeating patterns. There was no space for questions, no debate, no critical thinking. It was a system based on repetition. In addition, there was an obsession with the SAT exam. Students memorized endless lists of words, without context, without real reading, without meaningful writing. It was an artificial preparation for a world that demanded exactly the opposite. And then came extracurricular activities. Most participated in Model United Nations, an activity considered prestigious. But there was an obvious problem. Everyone was doing the same thing. There was no differentiation, no identity, no real experience. It was at this moment that he realized something essential. Getting into a good university was not the problem. The real problem was surviving after getting in. The solution would not come from small adjustments. It was necessary to change the logic of the system. The first change was radical. Traditional classes were replaced by seminars. Instead of rooms with 50 silent students, small groups of 10 to 20 gathered to discuss books. They read. They debated. They questioned. For the first time, learning became an active experience. The second change was even deeper. Memorizing words was no longer the priority. Reading became the center of the process. A library with 5,000 books in English was created. Students could choose, explore, discover. The goal was not just to learn English. It was to awaken the pleasure of reading. And then came the boldest break. Traditional activities were eliminated. In their place, real experiences emerged. The first was the coffee house, a cafe inside the school, managed by the students themselves. They handled service, operations, finances. They learned in practice what responsibility, collaboration, and entrepreneurship mean. It was not a simulation. It was reality. The second initiative was even more intense. A daily newspaper. Every day, students had to investigate, write, edit, and publish. They worked late into the night, sometimes until dawn. And still, the next day, they delivered the newspaper to the entire school. That was not just an activity. It was training for the real world. But changing activities was not enough. It was necessary to change the culture. Three principles began to guide everything: transparency, innovation, total openness. Nothing was fixed. The curriculum was not treated as something perfect. It evolved constantly. Mistakes were acknowledged. Adjustments were made collectively. Chaos was part of the process. And, surprisingly, it worked. In a short time, the program became extremely effective. Students began to stand out. They entered elite universities like Yale, Wharton, and Cornell. The program became the most respected in southern China. The results were undeniable. Everything seemed perfect, until everything collapsed. He was fired, without warning, without negotiation. And that was not all. Teachers, parents, and even students were satisfied with his departure. No one wanted him to stay. Even after creating one of the most successful programs in the country, he was never invited again to lead another. The system rejected him. But why? The answer is not in the success. It is in how the game works. He believed he was being seen as a reformer, a visionary, an idealist. But that was not the real perception. The word used to describe him was different. Dictator. Or, even more directly, someone difficult, uncomfortable, impossible to deal with. The reason was simple. He insisted on fairness. It didn't matter who the students were. It didn't matter who the parents were. Everyone had to work hard. And that broke the logic of the system. Because the system is not built on fairness. It is built on interests. That was when he began to see everything differently. Education was not just a process. It was a game. And like any game, there were players. Students, parents, teachers, administrators, government, universities, each with their own interests. And understanding those interests was the key to understanding everything that happened. Initially, he believed that students wanted to learn, that they sought to improve. But that was not entirely true. Students wanted results, with the least effort possible. Parents wanted success for their children. But in practice, they wanted status. They wanted to be able to say their children were in prestigious universities. The process didn't matter. The symbol did. Teachers were not focused on transforming lives. They were trying to survive, do the minimum necessary, receive their salary, and move on. Administrators wanted to maintain stability, avoid conflict, satisfy the most influential parents. The government wanted one thing above all: no problems. And the universities? They wanted students who could pay. Nothing more. And then the central principle emerges. In game theory, all participants seek the same objective, the best possible outcome, with the least effort possible. This is the invisible logic that sustains the system. And when someone tries to change this logic, they are not just proposing improvements. They are breaking the game, and the system reacts. It doesn't matter how good the results are. What matters is whether you respect the unwritten rules. Because in the end, it's not about education. It's about control. If you understand this, you begin to see something even deeper. The problem was never the method. The problem was the alignment of interests. A system only works when the main players agree, even silently, with the rules of the game. And those rules don't have to be fair. They only need to be convenient for those in power. That is exactly where everything came into conflict. To understand this clearly, it is necessary to observe not only who participates in the game, but who truly matters within it. Not all players carry the same weight. This is one of the most important lessons of game theory. On the surface, it seems that students are the center of education. They are the ones who attend school, who study, who take exams. But in practice, they have little influence. What students think rarely defines the rules. Those who define the game are the ones who sustain the system. And in this case, the most important were not the students. They were the parents. Parents are the ones who pay. They are the ones who can create problems. They are the ones who pressure the school. And because of that, their expectations shape how everything works. Right after, come the teachers, because they are the ones who execute the rules. They are the ones who turn decisions into practice. If teachers do not adhere, the system does not function. Administrators have an intermediate role. They adjust, negotiate, balance interests. But deep down, they are also trapped in the same logic of survival. The government, despite appearing powerful, has little real interference in the daily life of a specific school. As long as there are no problems, everything is acceptable. Universities, in turn, are also not deeply involved. They operate as a final stage of the process. They select, receive, and move on. Their focus is not the student's development. It is the continuous flow of applicants. When you mentally reorganize these weights, something becomes clear. The game is not built around learning. It is built around stability, status, and convenience. And this completely changes how every decision is made. Now, look at the students again. What truly motivates a student? It is not just learning. It is being accepted. It is belonging. It is building relationships. It is avoiding conflict. School, for many, is first and foremost a social space. Learning is just one part of the experience, and often, not even the main one. In addition, there is a decisive factor: the need to please. Students know, even unconsciously, that they depend on parency, depend on teachers, depend on evaluations. So their behavior adapts. They don't study necessarily to learn. They study to meet expectations. Grades become a form of approval, not of knowledge. Now observe parents more precisely. The discourse is about their children's future, but the real motivation is often different. Status, recognition, social validation. Having a child in a prestigious university is not just an academic achievement. It is a symbol. It is a way of telling the world that you succeeded. And this turns education into a product, a luxury product. The more expensive, the more valuable it seems. Quality does not necessarily matter. Perception matters. Image matters. And this explains decisions that, at first glance, seem irrational. Schools are chosen not for what they teach, but for how they are perceived. Teachers are valued not for their impact, but for their appearance. The system becomes performative. And then come the teachers. Many enter the profession with genuine intention. But the system shapes behavior. Over time, limitations emerge. Fatigue, external responsibilities, lack of recognition, and gradually, the focus shifts. Teaching stops being a mission and becomes a job. The objective becomes simple. Do what is necessary. Avoid problems. Maintain stability. It is not necessarily a lack of character. It is adaptation to the environment. Administrators follow the same logic. They are not there to revolutionize. They are there to keep the system functioning. Avoid conflicts with parents. Ensure apparent results. Preserve the school's reputation. Every decision is filtered through a silent question. Will this create a problem? If the answer is yes, the change is avoided, even if it is necessary. And then, when all these interests meet, something inevitable happens. The game forms. Not in an explicit way, but organically. The rules emerge from the point where these interests converge. And at that point, any attempt at real change becomes a threat. Because changing the system means altering incentives. It means demanding more effort. It means breaking established comforts. And no one wants that. That is exactly what happened. The new model worked. Students improved. Results were superior. But it required something the system was not willing to offer. Real effort. Responsibility. Autonomy. And that generated resistance. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incompatible with the existing game. This is the hardest point to accept. You can be right. You can generate results. You can improve everything, and still be rejected. Because the problem was never efficiency. It was alignment. When you try to change a system without understanding the interests that sustain it, you are not reforming. You are confronting. And confrontations, within structured systems, are rarely accepted. They are neutralized, silenced, removed. And then, an inevitable question arises. If the system does not reward those who truly improve things, then what does it actually reward? The answer is not comfortable, but it is necessary. The system rewards those who play according to its rules. Even if those rules do not lead to the best possible outcome, even if they keep everything in the same place, even if they limit potential, because in the end, stability is more valuable than excellence. And this does not happen only in education. This pattern repeats across different fields, companies, governments, organizations. Whenever interests converge to preserve the status quo, deep changes become threats. And those who promote those changes become problems. The question then stops being technical, stops being pedagogical, and becomes strategic. If you want to transform a system, it is not enough to be right. You must understand the game, understand the incentives, understand who wins and who loses, and above all, understand what each player is trying to protect. Because that is where the real dynamics happen. Then, an even deeper shift in perspective emerges. The question is no longer how to improve the system. It becomes something else. How do you change a system without being expelled by it? Because at that moment, it became clear that good ideas are not enough. Results are not enough. Not even success protects you. If the system does not recognize value in what you do, it will not absorb you. It will reject you. And this happens in a silent but extremely efficient way. The initial mistake was not technical. It was strategic. He tried to build a new game inside a system that did not want to change. And worse, he did it without aligning the interests of the most important players. That created a rupture the system could not accept. In game theory, there is an essential principle. Players do not change behavior because of ideas. They change because of incentives. If the incentive remains the same, behavior remains the same. This means that any attempt at real transformation must begin elsewhere, not with content, but with incentives. Look at what happened in practice. Students improved, but that required more effort, so it was not attractive to them. Parents saw good results, but they did not see control, and without control, they felt insecure. Teachers were pushed out of their comfort zone, and that generated resistance. Administrators saw risk, and risk for them was something to be avoided. In other words, everyone had something to lose, even if, in the long run, everyone would gain. This is one of the most counterintuitive points. Systems are rarely guided by the long term. They are guided by the short term, by the immediate, by what keeps everything working today. And any change that threatens this immediate balance tends to be rejected, even if it is better. So what could have been done differently? Perhaps it was not necessary to change everything at once. Perhaps the change could have been gradual, introduced almost invisibly, without creating shock, without exposing the system to rupture. Because when change is perceived as a threat, it activates defense mechanisms, and those mechanisms are extremely strong. Another possibility would be to align incentives. Make each player feel that they are winning, even if, in practice, they are being guided toward a new behavior. Students could see immediate benefits. Parents could maintain a sense of control. Teachers could be rewarded for adapting. Administrators could perceive safety. Without that, any change becomes a direct confrontation. And direct confrontations, within complex systems, rarely win. There is also a third dimension: perception. It is not enough to do something good. Others need to perceive it as good. And more than that, they need to perceive it as something that does not threaten their interests. Because the moment something appears threatening, the reaction is automatic. Rejection, labeling, isolation. That is exactly what happened. He was not seen as someone who improved the system. He was seen as someone who destabilized the system. And in that context, the result matters little. Perception matters. This leads to a difficult but fundamental conclusion. The most direct path is not always the most effective. Sometimes, real transformation requires strategy. It requires patience. It requires reading the context. And above all, it requires a deep understanding of human nature. Because in the end, systems are not made of rules. They are made of people, and people do not operate only with logic. They operate with fear, with interest, with comfort, with status. And any change that ignores this is bound to encounter resistance. So perhaps the greatest lesson is not in education, but in how any social structure functions. If you want to change something, you need to understand the game before playing. You need to know who the players are, what they want, what they fear losing, and what they are trying to preserve. Without that, even the best idea can fail. And perhaps this is the most important part of this entire story. The failure did not come from a lack of competence, nor from a lack of results. It came from a lack of alignment. It came from trying to change the system without first deeply understanding its invisible mechanisms. Because at its core, the system was never about learning, never about merit, never about excellence. It was about balancing interests. And that balance, however imperfect, is protected at all costs. Now the question changes again. If you already understand the game, what do you do with it? Do you try to change it? Do you play within the rules? Or do you find a way to influence it without being noticed? There is no single answer. But there is one certainty. Ignoring the game is never an option. Because when you ignore the game, you are not outside of it. You just don't understand why you are losing. Throughout this documentary, we explored evidence, accounts, and discoveries that attempt to explain this historical event. But one question remains unanswered. If everything happened exactly as we believe, then why are there so many contradictory records? Why do certain details seem to have disappeared from official history? Perhaps because this mystery has not yet been fully resolved, and perhaps there are still clues waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.